The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late April 1882, carried by a dusty rider who barely glanced at Grace Dawson before tipping his hat and riding back toward town, leaving her standing in the doorway of his ranch house with trembling hands and a heart that hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Grace had never seen a woman's handwriting before, at least not one that belonged to someone who would soon be his wife. And as he unfolded the cream-colored paper, he felt the weight of what he had done settling over his shoulders like an iron yoke. Her name was Katherine Parker. She was 22 years old, and she would arrive in Salida, Colorado in 3 weeks' time, ready to become his bride whether either of them truly wanted it or not. Grace set the letter down on the rough-hewn table in his kitchen and stared at it as though it might suddenly burst into flames. He was 26 years old, lean and weathered from years of working cattle in the high country, and until 6 months ago he had never imagined himself the marrying type. But the winters were long and lonely in the Colorado mountains, and when his older brother had suggested he might write to one of those agencies back east that matched women with Western men, Grace had been drunk enough and desperate enough to agree. Now, stone sober and terrified, he wondered what kind of woman would be willing to travel halfway across the country to marry a stranger. The ranch house was modest but well built, nestled in a valley with the Arkansas River running silver through the grassland, and the Sawatch Range rising like a wall to the west. Grace had built most of it himself over the past 4 years, cutting timber from the surrounding forest and hauling stone from the riverbed. It had 2 rooms, a main area that served as kitchen and living space, and a bedroom barely large enough for the bed he had constructed from lodgepole pine. He looked around now with fresh eyes, trying to imagine what Katherine Parker would think when she saw it. The floor was clean enough, the hearth well made, but there were no curtains on the windows, no rugs to soften the wooden planks, nothing that spoke of comfort or gentleness or the presence of a woman. For the next 3 weeks, Grace threw himself into preparation with an intensity that surprised even himself. He rode into Salida and bought fabric for curtains, pale blue cotton that the shopkeeper's wife assured him would brighten the place considerably. He traded a side of beef to a carpenter in town for a proper wardrobe and a rocking chair. He scrubbed the floors until his knees ached and whitewashed the walls until his shoulders burned. His cowhands, 2 brothers named Jim and Thomas who helped him run the cattle, watched his frenzy with barely concealed amusement. Never seen a man so worked up over a woman he has not even met, Jim said one evening as they sat around the fire outside the bunkhouse. Maybe he is worried she will take one look at this place and get right back on the train, Thomas added, grinning. Grace did not respond, just stared into the flames and wondered if they were right. What if Katherine Parker arrived expecting something grander, something more civilized? What if she took one look at him, at his calloused hands and sun-darkened face, and the way he still stumbled over his words when he was nervous, and decided she had made a terrible mistake? The day of her arrival came too quickly. Grace rode into Salida in the early afternoon, bathed and shaved and wearing his best shirt, the one without any patches or stains. The town sat at the confluence of several mountain valleys, a growing settlement that served the ranchers and miners scattered throughout the surrounding peaks. The train station was a simple wooden structure, but it represented connection to the wider world, a lifeline of steel and steam that stretched all the way back to the cities of the East. Grace waited on the platform as the train pulled in, black smoke billowing from its stack and brakes squealing against the rails. His heart was pounding so hard he thought everyone around him must be able to hear it. The doors opened, and passengers began to disembark, miners and merchants and families heading west in search of new opportunities. And then he saw her. Katherine Parker stepped down from the train with the careful movements of someone who had been traveling for days and was not entirely sure her legs would hold her. She was slight, barely reaching Grace's shoulder, with dark hair pinned up beneath a simple bonnet and eyes that seemed too large for her pale face. She wore a gray traveling dress that had seen better days, and she carried a single worn carpet bag that appeared to contain everything she owned in the world. But it was the way she held herself that struck Grace most, the rigid set of her shoulders and the way her eyes darted around the platform without ever quite settling on anything, as though she were a deer ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. He stepped forward, removing his hat. "Miss Parker." She turned toward him, and for just a moment their eyes met. Hers were brown, he noticed, a deep, warm brown that might have been beautiful if they had not been so filled with fear. She nodded once, a sharp, jerky movement. "I am Grace Dawson," he said, trying to keep his voice gentle. "Welcome to Salida." "Thank you." Her voice was barely above a whisper, and she did not offer her hand or smile or do any of the things he had imagined she might do. Instead, she simply stood there, clutching her bag as though it were a shield. An awkward silence stretched between them. Grace cleared his throat. "The ranch is about an hour's ride from here. I have brought the wagon. It is not much, but it is sturdy. That will be fine." He reached for her bag, intending to carry it for her, but the moment his fingers brushed the handle, she flinched back so violently that he nearly stumbled. Her face had gone even paler, if that were possible, and her breathing had become quick and shallow. "I can carry it myself," she said, and there was something in her tone that was not quite defiance but not quite submission either. Something broken. Grace held up his hands, trying to show he meant no harm. "Of course, the wagon is this way." They walked through town in silence, Grace leading the way and Katherine following several paces behind. He could feel the curious stares of the townspeople, could imagine what they were thinking. The mail-order bride had arrived, and she looked like a stiff wind might blow her away. He helped her up onto the wagon seat, careful not to touch her more than absolutely necessary, and then climbed up beside her and took the reins. The ride out to the ranch was excruciating. Grace tried several times to start a conversation, asking about her journey and whether she was hungry or tired, but Katherine's responses were monosyllabic and offered no openings for further discussion. She sat as far from him as the wagon seat would allow, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and her gaze fixed firmly on the road ahead. By the time they pulled up in front of the ranch house, Grace's initial nervousness had transformed into a heavy dread. He climbed down and started to offer his hand to help her descend, but she was already scrambling down on her own, landing awkwardly but managing to keep her feet. She looked at the house, at the mountains rising behind it and the river flowing past, and something flickered across her face that might have been relief or might have been despair. "It is not much," Grace said again, feeling the need to fill the silence. "But it is solid and the roof does not leak. I have fixed up the bedroom for you, and I put curtains in the windows like the shopkeeper's wife said would be nice." Katherine turned to look at him then, really look at him, and he saw something in her eyes that made his chest tighten. It was not just fear. It was terror, deep and bone-cold, the kind of terror that came from experience rather than imagination. "I need to tell you something," she said, and her voice was shaking. "Before we go any further, I need to tell you." "All right," Grace said carefully. She took a breath, her hands twisting together. "I know what the arrangement is. I know what you expect, but I cannot do it. I cannot be a proper wife to you, not in that way. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I need you to understand that before we go inside." Grace stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. "I do not understand. Please." The word came out as almost a sob. "Please do not touch me. I am asking you as kindly as I know how. I will cook and clean and do all the other things a wife should do, but please, please do not touch me." The raw desperation in her voice cut through Grace like a knife. He did not know what had happened to this woman, what had put that look in her eyes and that tremor in her voice, but he knew with sudden certainty that he would rather cut off his own hand than add to whatever pain she was already carrying. "All right," he said quietly. "I will not touch you. You have my word." She looked at him with something like disbelief, as though she had expected an entirely different response. "You promise?" "I promise. I am not the kind of man who would force himself on a woman, Katherine. I thought I was getting a partner, not a victim. If you need time, then you will have it, however much time you need." For a long moment she just stood there, searching his face as though trying to determine if he was telling the truth. Then, slowly, some of the terrible tension seemed to drain from her shoulders. "Thank you," she whispered. Grace picked up her bag from the wagon, moving slowly so as not to startle her, and gestured toward the house. "Come on. I will show you around, and then I expect you might want to rest. It has been a long journey." The interior of the house was dim and cool after the brightness outside. Grace set her bag down and gave her a brief tour, pointing out the stove and the pantry and the trunk where he kept the linens. When they reached the bedroom, he cleared his throat awkwardly. "This is yours now. I will sleep out here by the fire." Katherine looked from the bedroom to him and back again. "You are giving me the bedroom. It is only right. You are the lady of the house now. But where will you sleep?" "I will make up a bedroll by the hearth. I have slept in worse places, believe me. Spent half my life sleeping on the ground under the stars. A wooden floor by a warm fire is luxury in comparison." She shook her head slowly, as though she could not quite believe what she was hearing. "I do not understand you. Nothing to understand. I made you a promise and I intend to keep it." He moved back toward the main room, putting distance between them. "I will leave you to settle in. There is fresh water in the pitcher and I will start on supper in a bit. Do you like stew? I am not much of a cook, but I make a decent stew." "Stew is fine." She was still standing in the doorway of the bedroom, looking lost and uncertain. "Grace." It was the first time she had used his name, and something about hearing it in her voice made his heart skip. "Yes, thank you for understanding, for not being angry." "I am not angry, Katherine. Just do me one favor." "What is that?" "When you are ready, when you feel comfortable enough, will you tell me what happened to you? I would like to understand." Her face closed off immediately, all the fear rushing back. "I cannot." "All right, that is all right. The offer stands whenever you are ready. No pressure." That first night set the pattern for the days that followed. Grace slept on the floor with a bedroll and a blanket, the wooden planks hard beneath his back and the fire crackling in the hearth. It was not comfortable, but he had meant what he said about sleeping in worse places. Katherine kept to the bedroom, emerging only for meals and to help with the housework. She cooked and cleaned with an efficiency that suggested she had been doing such work all her life, but she rarely spoke, and she never smiled. She moved through the house like a ghost, always careful to keep furniture or distance between herself and Grace, always watching him with those enormous frightened eyes. Grace tried to give her space while also trying to help her feel at home. He spoke to her gently, asked her opinion on small matters around the ranch, thanked her for the meals she prepared. He never reached for her, never made any sudden movements in her direction, never did anything that might be construed as threatening. It was exhausting, this constant vigilance, but he told himself it would get better with time. She just needed to learn that she was safe here, that he was a man of his word. A week passed, then two. The nights on the floor were starting to take their toll on Grace's back, and Jim and Thomas had noticed that something was off, though they were too polite to ask directly. Grace threw himself into work during the day, riding out to check the cattle and mend fences and do all the 100 small tasks that came with running a ranch. Katherine spent her days transforming the house, washing and mending and adding small touches that made it feel more like a home. She found wildflowers growing along the river and brought them inside in a jar. She rearranged the kitchen to be more efficient. She even attempted to make curtains for the bedroom window, though Grace noticed she struggled with the sewing. One evening, about 3 weeks after her arrival, Grace came in from working with the horses to find Katherine standing at the stove, stirring a pot of something that smelled surprisingly good. The lamplight caught the curve of her cheek and the dark sweep of her hair, and for a moment Grace allowed himself to really look at her. She was pretty, he realized. Not in the bold, obvious way of the saloon girls in town, but in a quiet, fragile way that made his chest ache. He found himself wondering what she would look like if she smiled, if that fear ever left her eyes. "Smells good," he said, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. She glanced at him briefly. "It is just chicken and dumplings. I found the chickens out back and thought I would use one." "That sounds like a feast compared to my usual fare." They ate in silence, as they usually did, but Grace noticed that Katherine seemed slightly less tense than normal. She even looked at him once or twice across the table, quick darting glances that she immediately looked away from when he met her eyes. "Katherine," he said carefully, setting down his fork, "I was wondering if you might tell me a bit about yourself." "Nothing painful," he added quickly, seeing her tense. "Just simple things. Where you are from, what you like, that sort of thing." She was quiet for so long that he thought she would not answer. Then slowly she said, "I am from Pennsylvania, a town called Harrisburg. My parents died when I was 16 and I went to live with my aunt." "I am sorry about your parents. That must have been hard." She nodded, her gaze fixed on her plate. "It was. They were good people. My father worked in a mill and my mother took in sewing. We did not have much, but we were happy." "And your aunt?" Katherine's hands tightened around her fork. "She was not a kind woman, but she gave me a place to live, and I tried to be grateful for that." Grace waited, sensing there was more to the story, but Katherine did not continue. Instead, she stood abruptly and began clearing the dishes, her movements quick and jerky. He let it go, knowing he had pushed as far as he could for one night. That night, lying on his bedroll by the fire, Grace stared at the ceiling and thought about Katherine Parker. She was a puzzle, a mystery wrapped in fear and pain, and despite everything he found himself wanting to solve her. Not in a possessive way, but in the way you wanted to fix something broken, to restore it to what it should be. He wanted to see her smile. He wanted to hear her laugh. He wanted to know what had hurt her so badly that she could not bear to be touched. The 4th week brought a change. Grace woke one morning to find Katherine already up and making breakfast, which was not unusual, but what was unusual was the way she looked at him when he emerged from his bedroll. "Good morning," she said, and there was something different in her voice. Not warmth exactly, but less of the sharp edge of fear. "Morning," he replied, running a hand through his hair. "You are up early. I could not sleep." She turned back to the stove, flipping flapjacks with practiced ease. "Grace, I have been thinking." "About what?" "About you sleeping on the floor. You have been doing it for a month now, and it cannot be comfortable. Your back must be hurting." He shrugged, though she was right. His back was a constant dull ache these days. "I am managing." "I do not think it is right. This is your house, your bed. I am the interloper here." "You are not an interloper. You are my wife." She flinched slightly at the word, but pressed on. "In name only. I have not been much of a wife to you, Grace. I know that." And I am grateful that you have not pushed, but I also feel guilty watching you sleep on the floor every night. Do not feel guilty. I made you a promise. I know you did, and you have kept it. She set a plate of flapjacks in front of him, then sat down across the table with her own plate. But I want to make you an offer. What if we shared the bedroom? Not the bed, she added quickly, seeing his expression. But the room. You could put your bedroll on the floor in there, and at least you would have the softer rug and a door between you and the drafts from the main room. Grace considered this carefully. On the one hand, it would be more comfortable. On the other hand, he did not want Katherine to feel pressured or uncomfortable in the one space that was entirely hers. Are you sure? I do not want you to feel trapped or worried. I trust you, she said, and the words seemed to surprise her as much as they surprised him. You have had a month to break your promise, and you have not. I think I am starting to believe that you really are different from other men I have known. There was a world of pain in that simple statement, and Grace felt a surge of anger toward whoever had taught her that men were not to be trusted. But he kept his voice calm and even. If you are certain, then I accept. Thank you, Katherine. That night, Grace laid out his bedroll on the floor beside the bed, positioning it so that he was facing away from where Katherine would sleep. It was strange, being in the same room with her, hearing the rustle of her dress as she changed behind the privacy screen he had set up in the corner, listening to the soft sound of her breathing as she settled into bed. He lay awake for a long time, acutely aware of her presence just a few feet away, before finally drifting into an uneasy sleep. Over the next week, a tentative routine developed. They shared the bedroom at night, Grace on the floor and Katherine in the bed, and during the day they worked side by side in a careful dance of proximity and distance. Katherine began to talk more, sharing small details about her life before Colorado. She told him about learning to cook from her mother, about the books she had loved to read when she could get her hands on them, about the garden she had tended at her aunt's house. Grace, in turn, told her about growing up on a small ranch in Wyoming, about coming to Colorado to make his own way, about the satisfaction of building something with his own hands. They were sitting on the porch one evening, watching the sun set behind the mountains, when Katherine finally asked the question Grace had been waiting for. Why did you send for a mail-order bride? A man like you could have courted someone local. Grace shook his head. Not many women out here, and the ones that are here already have their pick of suitors. Besides, I am not much good at courting, never have been. Writing letters seemed easier somehow. What did you expect when I arrived? Honestly, I do not know. Someone who would not mind the isolation, I suppose. Someone strong enough to handle ranch life. I did not think much beyond that. Did you expect to fall in love? The question caught him off guard. He looked at her, at the way the fading light caught in her hair and softened the lines of worry on her face. I hoped for it, maybe, but I would have settled for partnership, for someone to share the work and the silence with. Love seemed like asking for too much. And now I think maybe I was wrong. The words came out before he could stop them, and he saw Katherine's eyes widen. He pressed on, knowing he had already said too much to back down now. I know this is not what either of us planned, Katherine. I know you have reasons for being afraid, and I do not expect anything from you that you are not ready to give. But I want you to know that I am glad you are here. These past weeks, getting to know you, even in this limited way, it has been good. Better than I expected. She was silent for a long moment, and when she spoke her voice was thick with emotion. I need to tell you something, about why I am the way I am. Grace's heart began to pound. You do not have to, I think I do. I think you deserve to know. She took a shaky breath, her hands twisting together in her lap. My aunt, the one I went to live with after my parents died, she was married to a man named Richard. He was a shopkeeper, well respected in town, the kind of man everyone thought was upstanding and honorable. But behind closed doors, he was a monster. Grace felt his stomach drop, already knowing where this was going but hoping desperately that he was wrong. "It started small," Katherine continued, her voice flat and distant. "Comments about how I looked, how I should be grateful to him for taking me in. Then it was touches, casual at first, a hand on my shoulder or my waist that lingered too long. My aunt either did not notice or did not care. When I tried to tell her, she said I was being ungrateful, that I should be honored by his attention." "Katherine," Grace said softly, but she shook her head. "Let me finish, please. If I stop now, I might never be able to say it." She took another breath. "It went on for years. I tried to avoid him, tried to make myself invisible, but there was nowhere to go. I had no money, no other family. And then one day I saw an advertisement for mail-order brides, and I thought maybe it was my way out. I did not care where I ended up or who I married, as long as it was far away from Richard and that house. I scraped together enough money for the train ticket and left without looking back. Did he?" Grace could not finish the question, but Katherine understood. "No, not in that way. But he tried. And I spent 6 years living in fear that one day he would succeed, that my aunt would turn a blind eye like she did to everything else." She turned to look at Grace then, and there were tears streaming down her face. "When I saw you at the train station, I thought I had made a terrible mistake. I thought I had traded one monster for another. But you were not a monster. You kept your promise. You slept on the floor for a month just to make me feel safe. I do not think you understand what that means to me." Grace felt his own eyes burning. Without thinking, he reached out his hand, palm up, an invitation rather than a demand. "You are safe here, Katherine. I swear to you, you are safe." For a long moment she just looked at his hand, and he thought she would not take it. But then, slowly, hesitantly, she reached out and laid her hand in his. Her fingers were small and cool, and they trembled slightly, but they were there, resting against his palm like a bird that might take flight at any moment. "Thank you," she whispered, "for being kind, for being patient, for being everything he was not." They sat like that as the sun disappeared behind the mountains and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, their hands joined in a connection that was fragile but real. Grace felt something shift in his chest, a tenderness so fierce it almost hurt. This broken, frightened woman had trusted him with her story, had placed her hand in his despite everything she had been through. He would guard that trust with his life. The weeks that followed brought subtle changes. Katherine still startled easily and still kept her distance most of the time. But there were moments now when she would reach out to touch his arm when she wanted his attention, or stand close beside him when they worked together in the kitchen. She smiled occasionally, small hesitant smiles that transformed her face and made Grace's heart skip. She even laughed once, a surprised burst of sound when he told her about a particularly stubborn cow that had led him on a chase halfway across the ranch. The sound of her laughter was like music, and Grace found himself trying to coax it out of her more often. One afternoon in early July, Grace came back to the house to find Katherine on the porch with a letter in her hands and tears streaming down her face. His first instinct was panic, thinking something terrible had happened, but when he got closer he saw that she was smiling through the tears. "What is it?" he asked, keeping his distance but close enough to hear her. "It is from a friend I had back in Harrisburg, a girl named Mary who worked at the bakery. I wrote to her after I arrived here, but I did not think she would write back. I thought maybe she had forgotten about me." She held up the letter, her hands shaking, but she remembered. "She says she is happy I escaped, that everyone in town has been talking about how Richard got caught trying to force himself on the minister's daughter and he is in jail now. My aunt has left town in disgrace." Grace felt a savage satisfaction at that news. Good. He deserves worse than jail. Mary says the minister's daughter is all right, that she fought him off and screamed loud enough to bring half the town running. He is going to be in prison for a very long time. Katherine wiped at her tears, her smile growing wider. "I am so relieved. I have been having nightmares about him finding me somehow, tracking me down out here. But he cannot hurt anyone now. He is finally paying for what he did." "I am glad," Grace said, and meant it with his whole heart. "You can rest easy now." "I can," she said, and then, to his surprise, she stood and walked over to him. She stopped just a foot away, closer than she had ever voluntarily come before, and looked up into his face. "Grace, I want to thank you for everything, for taking a chance on a stranger, for being patient with me, for being the kind of man who sleeps on the floor for a month because he made a promise. You do not need to thank me." "Yes, I do. You have given me my life back. You have shown me that not all men are like Richard, that some men can be trusted and kind and good." She hesitated, then reached up and placed her hand on his cheek, the first time she had ever initiated such contact. Her palm was warm against his skin, and Grace held perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. "I think I am ready to try," she said softly. "Try what? To be a real wife to you. To let you court me properly, the way you would have if we had met under different circumstances. I am not saying I am ready for everything, not yet, but I would like to try, if you still want to." Grace covered her hand with his own, holding it gently against his face. "I want to. More than anything." "Then court me, Grace Dawson. Show me what it is like to be cherished instead of feared." So he courted her, there in the high country of Colorado, with the mountains standing witness and the river singing its endless song. He brought her wildflowers from the meadows, bouquets of columbine and Indian paintbrush that she arranged in jars around the house. He took her riding in the evenings, showing her the hidden corners of the ranch, the places where elk came to graze and eagles nested in the cliffs. He read to her from the few books he owned, his voice stumbling over the more complex words but steady in its determination. He taught her to fish in the river, standing beside her on the bank and showing her how to cast the line, careful to keep his touch light and brief. And Katherine began to bloom. The fear faded from her eyes, replaced by something warmer and brighter. She laughed more often, a sound that never failed to make Grace's heart lift. She touched him more freely, taking his hand when they walked or resting her head on his shoulder when they sat on the porch in the evenings. She even kissed him once, a brief, soft press of her lips against his cheek that left him stunned and grinning like a fool. 3 months after her arrival, on a warm August evening, Katherine came to him as he was settling down on his bedroll in their shared room. She stood beside the bed, her hair loose around her shoulders and her nightgown white in the lamplight. "Grace," she said softly. "Yes." "I do not want you to sleep on the floor anymore." His heart began to pound. "Katherine, you do not have to do anything you are not ready for, I know. But I am ready. Not for everything, maybe, but to have you beside me, to fall asleep in your arms, to wake up and know you are there." She held out her hand to him. "Will you come to bed with me, just to hold me? Nothing more, not tonight, but I do not want that floor between us any more." Grace took her hand and let her pull him to his feet. He climbed into the bed beside her, his movements careful and deliberate, and when she curled against his side, her head on his chest and her arm across his waist, he thought his heart might burst from the sheer joy of it. "Is this all right?" she asked, her voice muffled against his shirt. "This is perfect," he said, wrapping his arm around her shoulders and holding her close. "You are perfect." She laughed softly. "I am far from perfect. I am broken and scared and probably always will be a little bit. Then we will be broken and scared together. I am not perfect either, Katherine." but I think maybe we fit together anyway." They lay in the darkness, listening to each other breathe, and Grace felt something settle in his chest that he had not even realized was unsettled. This was right. This was home. Not the house or the ranch or even the mountains, but this woman in his arms, trusting him with her safety and her heart. The seasons turned. Fall came to the high country, painting the aspens gold and sending the elk down from the higher elevations. Katherine helped with the harvest, preserving vegetables and putting up stores for the winter. She learned to manage the chickens and milk the cow Grace had purchased from a neighboring ranch. She became friends with the wives of other ranchers, women who came calling and invited her to church socials and quilting bees. She was building a life here, putting down roots, and Grace watched her transformation with a mixture of pride and wonder. Winter arrived in November, bringing snow that piled high against the sides of the house and turned the world white and silent. Grace moved the cattle closer to the barn, where he could feed them through the worst of the weather, and settled in for the long, quiet months ahead. But this winter was different from all the ones that had come before, because this winter he had Katherine. They spent the evenings by the fire, Grace mending tack or carving small figures from wood while Katherine sewed or read aloud from the books they had acquired. They cooked together, their movements in the small kitchen becoming a synchronized dance. They slept curled together in the bed, Katherine's back pressed against Grace's chest and his arm around her waist, a configuration that made them both feel safe and cherished. On Christmas Eve, Grace surprised Katherine with a gift he had been working on in secret for months. It was a music box, not a fancy one from a store, but one he had made himself from scraps of wood and metal. It played a simple tune, slightly off-key but recognizable as a lullaby his mother used to sing. Katherine held it in her hands, tears streaming down her face as the tinny music filled the room. "Grace, this is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever given me. I wanted you to have something special, something to remember this year by." She set the music box carefully on the table and turned to him, rising on her toes to kiss him. It was not their first kiss, but it was the first one she had initiated with such confidence, such clear intent. Grace kissed her back, his hands coming up to cup her face, and felt the last of the walls between them begin to crumble. "I love you," she said when they finally broke apart, her forehead resting against his. "I did not think I would ever be able to say those words to a man, but I love you, Grace Dawson. You have given me everything I thought I had lost." "I love you too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You have made this house a home, Katherine. You have made my life worth living." That night, she came to him not with fear or hesitation but with love and trust, and Grace cherished every moment of it, determined to show her that intimacy could be gentle and beautiful rather than painful and frightening. He took his time, asking permission with every touch, watching her face for any sign of distress. And when it was over and she lay in his arms with tears on her cheeks, he held her close and promised her that every night for the rest of their lives would be like this, safe and tender and filled with love. The winter passed, and spring returned to the mountains, bringing green grass and wildflowers and the sound of water rushing in the swollen river. Katherine discovered she was pregnant in April, exactly a year after Grace had received the letter announcing her arrival. She told him one morning over breakfast, her face glowing with a mixture of joy and nervousness. "Are you happy?" she asked, watching his reaction carefully. Grace came around the table and pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around. "Happy does not even begin to cover it. You have made me the luckiest man alive." The pregnancy was not easy. Katherine was sick in the mornings and tired in the afternoons, and as summer progressed and her belly grew, She found it harder to do all the tasks she had taken on around the ranch. But Grace was there for every moment of it, taking over the cooking when the smell of food made her nauseous, helping her with her shoes when she could no longer reach her feet, rubbing her back when it ached from carrying the extra weight. Their son was born on a cold January morning in 1884, arriving with a healthy set of lungs and a shock of dark hair. They named him Daniel, after Grace's father, and Katherine cried as she held him for the first time, overwhelmed by the fierce protective love that washed over her. "I never thought I would have this," she said, looking up at Grace with wonder in her eyes. "A husband who loves me, a baby of my own, a home where I feel safe. I thought Richard had stolen all of that from me, but you gave it back." Grace kissed her forehead, careful not to jostle the baby sleeping in her arms. "You did it yourself, Katherine. You were brave enough to leave, brave enough to take a chance on a stranger in Colorado, brave enough to trust again. I just provided the floor to sleep on." She laughed at that, the sound mixing with her tears. "That floor. I will never forget how you kept that promise, Grace, how you slept on the hard wood for a whole month just to make me feel safe. That was when I started to believe that maybe everything would be all right." Everything is more than all right. Everything is perfect. Little Daniel grew into a sturdy, curious child who loved to follow his father around the ranch, toddling after Grace on chubby legs and demanding to be lifted up to see the horses. Katherine blossomed in motherhood, her natural warmth and tenderness finding full expression in caring for their son. The fear that had haunted her eyes when she first arrived was gone completely now, replaced by confidence and joy. They added to the house as the years passed, building a second bedroom for Daniel and expanding the kitchen. Grace hired more hands to help with the growing herd, and the ranch prospered. Katherine started a garden that became the envy of the neighboring ranches, producing vegetables and flowers that she shared generously with anyone who visited. They became pillars of the small community around Salida, known for their hospitality and kindness. In the fall of 1886, Katherine gave birth to twin daughters, identical little girls they named Sarah and Emma. Grace was completely undone by them, these tiny perfect creatures who looked exactly like their mother. He spent hours just watching them sleep, marveling at their miniature fingers and the way they seemed to communicate with each other, even as infants. "We are going to need a bigger house," Katherine said one evening, looking around at the controlled chaos of children and toys and the general disorder that came with 3 young ones. "Then we will build a bigger house," Grace said without hesitation. "Whatever you need, Katherine. Whatever will make you happy." "I am already happy, happier than I ever dreamed possible." She leaned against him, fitting perfectly under his arm the way she always had. "Do you ever think about that first day when I got off the train looking like a frightened rabbit?" "I think about it sometimes. I think about how close I came to losing you before I ever really had you. If you had gotten back on that train, if you had decided I was just another man who could not be trusted." "I almost did," she admitted. "That first week I thought about running so many times. But you never gave me a reason to. You just kept being kind and patient and true to your word. You broke down my walls without me even realizing it was happening." "I fell in love with you that first month," Grace confessed. "Watching you move around the house, seeing little glimpses of who you really were beneath all that fear. I knew I wanted to spend the rest of my life making you smile. You have succeeded beyond measure." She turned to kiss him, a sweet, lingering kiss that still made his heart race even after years of marriage. "I love you, Grace Dawson. Thank you for sleeping on the floor for me. Thank you for keeping your promise. Thank you for showing me what love really means." The years continued to roll by, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their children. Daniel grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved working with the animals and dreamed of running the ranch himself one day. Sarah and Emma were whirlwinds of energy and mischief, constantly getting into trouble and charming their way out of it with identical dimpled smiles. In 1889, Katherine gave birth to another son, whom they named Michael, and in 1892, a daughter they called Grace after her father, much to his delight and embarrassment. The ranch continued to thrive under Grace's steady management and Katherine's careful attention to the household finances. They bought more land, expanding their holdings to include a second valley where they ran sheep, in addition to cattle. They built the bigger house Katherine had wanted, a sprawling structure with enough bedrooms for all the children and a proper parlor where Katherine could entertain the ladies who came to call. But despite the prosperity and the growth, they never forgot where they had started. Grace kept the old ranch house standing, converting it into a bunkhouse for the hired hands. And in the main bedroom of the new house, Katherine kept the music box Grace had made for her, winding it up every Christmas Eve and letting the off-key lullaby fill the room while she and Grace remembered that first difficult year, and everything they had overcome to build the life they now shared. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1902, Grace planned a surprise for Katherine. He arranged for the children to spend the night with neighbors, and he prepared a special dinner with food he had practiced making in secret. When Katherine came in from the garden that evening, she found the dining room transformed, with candles and flowers and her best dishes set out on the table. "Grace Dawson, what is all this?" she asked, her eyes shining. "It is our anniversary. 20 years since you stepped off that train in Salida and changed my life forever." 20 years, she repeated wonderingly. "How is that possible? It feels like yesterday and a lifetime ago all at once." They ate the dinner Grace had prepared, laughing when parts of it turned out less than perfect, but enjoying it nonetheless. Afterward, they sat on the porch of their new house, looking out at the ranch they had built together, and Grace took Katherine's hand in his. "I have been thinking," he said, "about that first month when I slept on the floor. I want you to know that I would do it again in a heartbeat. I would sleep on that floor for a year, for 10 years, for the rest of my life if that was what you needed to feel safe and loved." Katherine squeezed his hand, her eyes full of tears. "I know you would. That is who you are, Grace. The kind of man who keeps his promises no matter what. The kind of man who sees a broken woman and does not try to fix her but just loves her until she can fix herself. You were never broken, Katherine, just hurt. There is a difference. Maybe. But you healed me anyway. You and this place and our children and the life we have built. You gave me everything I thought I had lost forever. And you gave me a reason to build something worth having. Before you came, this ranch was just a place I worked. You made it a home. You made me a better man." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set behind the mountains, their hands intertwined and their hearts full. 20 years of marriage, 5 children, countless challenges overcome and joys shared. It had all started with a letter and a promise, with a frightened woman on a train platform and a man willing to sleep on the floor to prove he could be trusted. As the years continued to pass, Grace and Katherine settled into the rhythms of long marriage. Their children grew and began to make their own ways in the world. Daniel took over more and more of the ranch operations, proving himself to be as capable and hardworking as his father. The twins, Sarah and Emma, married brothers from a ranch 2 valleys over in a double wedding that was the talk of the county for years. Michael decided he wanted to study veterinary medicine and left for school in Denver, promising to come back and serve the ranching community. Little Grace, true to her namesake, was quiet and steady, preferring books to horses, but loving the ranch nonetheless. Through it all, Grace and Katherine remained each other's constants. They still shared the same bed every night, still fell asleep in each other's arms the way they had for 2 decades. They worked side by side during the day and talked for hours in the evening, never running out of things to say to each other. They had their disagreements, as all couples did, but they had learned early how to fight fair and forgive quickly. One evening in the summer of 1908, Grace found Katherine in the garden, her hair now streaked with silver, and her face lined with the marks of a life well lived. She was cutting flowers for the table, humming softly to herself, and the sight of her made his heart swell with the same love he had felt 26 years ago, when she had placed her trembling hand in his and trusted him not to hurt her. "Hello, beautiful," he said, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. She leaned back against him, comfortable and confident in his embrace. "Hello yourself, handsome. What are you doing sneaking up on me in the garden, just admiring my wife? Is that a crime?" "Not a crime, but highly suspicious. What do you want, Grace Dawson?" He laughed and turned her in his arms so he could see her face. "I want the same thing I have wanted for the past 26 years. You, Katherine, just you for the rest of my life. Well, you are stuck with me now. Too late to change your mind." "I would not change my mind if I could. You are the best decision I ever made, even if I did have to sleep on the floor for a month to prove myself." Katherine reached up and cupped his face in her hands, her touch as gentle and loving as it had been uncertain and fearful in those early days. "That floor changed everything, you know. Every night you kept your promise, I fell a little bit more in love with you. By the end of that month, I was completely gone. I just did not know how to tell you yet. I know. I could see it in your eyes, the way the fear started to fade and something else took its place. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever witnessed. We have had a good life, have we not?" Katherine asked, her eyes searching his face. "Despite everything, despite how we started, we have built something real and lasting." "We have built something extraordinary," Grace corrected. "And we are not done yet. We have grandchildren to spoil and many more years ahead of us." They had their first grandchild later that year, when Sarah gave birth to a son. More grandchildren followed in quick succession as their children started families of their own. Grace and Katherine delighted in being grandparents, finding new joy in watching their children become parents, and seeing the family they had started continue to grow and flourish. In the winter of 1915, Grace fell ill with pneumonia. It was a frightening time, with the doctor making daily visits and Katherine refusing to leave his side. She sat by his bed day and night, wiping his fevered brow and forcing him to drink broth and water, determined not to lose him after all they had been through together. On the worst night, when Grace's fever spiked and he drifted in and out of consciousness, Katherine climbed into the bed beside him and held him in her arms. "You listen to me, Grace Dawson," she said fiercely, her tears falling on his face. "You do not get to leave me. We have a deal, remember? For the rest of our lives. You promised me, and you always keep your promises." Grace opened his eyes and looked at her, his vision blurry but his love for her clear and strong. "Not done with you yet," he managed to whisper. "Never be done with you. That is right. So you fight this, do you hear me? You fight and you come back to me." And he did fight, with Katherine's love and fierce determination as his anchor. Slowly, over the course of several weeks, he began to recover. By early spring, he was back on his feet, thinner and weaker than before, but alive and grateful for every additional day he had been given. "You saved my life," he told Katherine one evening as they sat together watching the sunset, a ritual they had maintained for over 30 years. "You saved mine first," she replied simply. "I was just returning the favor. The years that followed were gentler, slower. Grace and Katherine handed over most of the ranch operations to Daniel and his wife, content to spend their days in each other's company and enjoy the fruits of a lifetime of hard work. They traveled some, taking the train to Denver and even once to San Francisco, marveling at how much the world had changed since Katherine had first stepped off the train in Salida all those years ago. But they always came home to the ranch, to the mountains and the river and the life they had built together. It was here, in this place that had seen their struggles and their triumphs, that they felt most at peace. On a warm evening in June 1922, 40 years to the day after Katherine had arrived in Colorado, Grace and Katherine sat together on the porch of their home. They were both in their 60s now, their hair white and their faces weathered, but their love for each other burned as bright as it had in those early days when every moment together was a precious gift. 40 years, Katherine said, shaking her head in wonder. 40 years since I got off that train, scared out of my mind and certain I had made the worst mistake of my life. And what do you think now? Grace asked, though he knew the answer. He just loved hearing her say it. I think it was the best decision I ever made. I think getting on that train and coming to Colorado and trusting you was the moment my real life began. She took his hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. You gave me everything, Grace. Safety, love, a family, a home. You took a terrified, broken girl and loved her into a whole woman. You gave me just as much. You taught me what it meant to be patient, to be gentle, to earn someone's trust instead of demanding it. You made me a better man. We made each other better. That is what love does, I think. It takes two imperfect people and helps them become the best versions of themselves. Grace leaned over and kissed her, a soft, sweet kiss that still made his heart race even after 4 decades. I would do it all again, Katherine. Every moment, every challenge, every night on that floor. I would do it all again just to end up here with you. Me too, she whispered against his lips. Me too. They sat together as the sun sank behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and purple. Around them, the sounds of the ranch continued its eternal rhythm, the lowing of cattle and the whinny of horses and the distant laughter of grandchildren playing in the yard. It was a symphony of life, of family, of love that had endured through decades and challenges and changes. The years continued their steady march. Grace and Katherine celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. It was a joyous occasion, with food and music and stories shared about the couple who had started with nothing but a promise and a willingness to try. Daniel stood up to give a toast. His own children gathered around him. To my parents, he said, his voice thick with emotion, who taught us all what real love looks like, who showed us that trust has to be earned, that promises should be kept, and that the strongest foundations are built on patience and kindness. Dad slept on the floor for a month to prove to Mom that she was safe, and in doing so, he showed all of us what it means to put someone else's needs before your own. Here is to 50 more years. Grace and Katherine smiled at each other, knowing that 50 more years was unlikely but grateful for every day they had been given. They had lived a full life, rich in love and family and purpose. They had built something that would outlast them, a legacy of kindness and integrity that their children and grandchildren would carry forward. In the quiet moments, when they were alone together, Grace and Katherine often found themselves reminiscing about those early days. The fear and uncertainty, the careful dance of learning to trust, the moment when Katherine had finally felt safe enough to take his hand. It all seemed like both yesterday and a lifetime ago, moments frozen in memory, but also the foundation upon which their entire life together had been built. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you had not kept your promise?" Katherine asked one evening. "If you had been like other men, if you had demanded your rights as a husband." Grace shuddered at the thought. "I think I would have destroyed you. I think you would have run away or shut down completely, and I would have lost the chance to know the real you. That promise was not a sacrifice, Katherine. It was an investment, the best one I ever made. It was still remarkable. Not many men would have had the patience or the wisdom to see that what I needed most was time and space. I just wanted you to be happy. Everything else came from that." As they moved into their twilight years, Grace and Katherine remained inseparable. When Grace's health began to fail in earnest, Katherine was there every step of the way, just as she had been during his bout with pneumonia years before. She held his hand through the doctor's visits, helped him when his strength failed, and never once complained about the role reversal that saw her caring for him the way he had once cared for her. "You do not have to do all this," Grace said one morning as Katherine helped him dress. "We could hire someone." "I do not want anyone else," Katherine said firmly. "You took care of me when I needed it most. Now it is my turn. Besides, where else would I rather be than with you?" On a clear autumn morning in 1928, Grace Dawson passed away peacefully in his sleep, Katherine's hand in his and a smile on his face. He was 72 years old and had lived to see 4 children, 16 grandchildren, and 5 great-grandchildren. His funeral was attended by everyone in the county, a testament to the respect and affection he had earned through a lifetime of integrity and kindness. Katherine stood at his graveside, her children around her and her grandchildren gathered close, and spoke the words she had kept in her heart for 46 years. "He was the best man I ever knew," she said simply. "He kept his promises. He loved without conditions. He showed me what it meant to be cherished. The world is dimmer without him in it, but his light will live on in all of us." She lived for another 7 years, spending her time surrounded by family and tending the garden that had always brought her peace. She never remarried, never even considered it. Grace had been her one great love, the man who had seen past her fear and loved her into wholeness. There would never be another like him. On the anniversary of Grace's death each year, Katherine would take flowers to his grave and sit beside it, talking to him as though he were still there. She told him about the grandchildren and their accomplishments, about the changes on the ranch, about how much she missed him but also how grateful she was for the life they had shared. "You kept your promise, Grace," she would say, her hand resting on the stone marker. "You slept on the floor for a month, and you spent the next 45 years making sure I felt safe and loved. I could not have asked for more. I will carry your love with me until we meet again." Katherine Parker Dawson passed away peacefully in her sleep in the spring of 1935, surrounded by her children and with a smile on her face. Her last words were about Grace, about how she could see him waiting for her, and how handsome he still looked after all these years. They buried her beside him in the small cemetery outside Salida, under the shadow of the mountains they had both loved. Their headstone was simple, bearing their names and dates and a single line that summed up the story of their love. He kept his promise. She kept his heart. The ranch passed to Daniel and then to his children, but the story of Grace and Katherine lived on. It became a family legend, told and retold to each new generation. The story of the mail-order bride who arrived terrified and broken, and the cowboy who slept on the floor for a month to prove she was safe. The story of how patience and kindness can heal even the deepest wounds, how love is not about taking but about giving, how promises kept can build a foundation that lasts for generations. The old ranch house where they had first lived, where Grace had laid his bedroll on the floor night after night, was preserved and maintained by the family. It became a place of pilgrimage for the descendants, a reminder of where it all began. Young couples would visit before their weddings, hoping to capture some of the magic that Grace and Katherine had found in those difficult early days. And in the main house, now occupied by great-great-grandchildren who had never met their famous ancestors, the music box Grace had made for Katherine still sat in a place of honor. Every Christmas Eve, the family would gather and wind it up, letting the off-key lullaby fill the room while they remembered the couple who had shown them all what real love looked like. The legacy of Grace and Katherine Dawson was not measured in land or cattle or money, though they had been successful by those standards too. Their legacy was measured in the love they had shared, the family they had built, and the example they had set for how to treat each other with kindness and respect. They had taken a broken beginning and transformed it into something beautiful, proving that sometimes the best love stories start with the simple act of keeping a promise. In the end, Grace had been right all those years ago when he had laid down on the hard wooden floor and told Katherine he would not touch her until she was ready. It had not been a sacrifice. It had been an investment, one that had paid dividends beyond anything he could have imagined. A month on the floor had bought him a lifetime of love, a family that would endure for generations, and a place in the hearts of everyone who heard his story. And Katherine, who had stepped off that train in 1882 expecting nothing but more pain and fear, had found instead a safe harbor, a true partner, and a love that had healed her and sustained her through all the joys and sorrows of a long life. She had taken a leap of faith on a stranger in Colorado, and that stranger had become her everything. Their story became more than just a family tale. It became a reminder that love is not about grand gestures or passionate declarations, though those have their place. Sometimes, the deepest love is found in quiet acts of respect and patience, in sleeping on the floor when your comfort would cost someone else their peace, in waiting as long as it takes for trust to build, in proving, day after day, that your word is good and your love is real. The mountains that had watched over Grace and Katherine still stand, eternal and unchanging. The Arkansas River still flows through the valley, singing the same song it sang when they first walked its banks together. The ranch still operates, now run by the fifth generation of Dawsons, all of whom know the story of their great-great-grandparents and the month that changed everything. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun sets behind the peaks and the world grows still, those who listen carefully swear they can hear the echo of that old music box, playing its off-key lullaby across the years. It is the sound of a promise kept, a love honored, and a legacy that will never fade as long as there are people who remember that the best foundations are built not on passion alone, but on patience, kindness, and the simple courage to keep your word no matter what it costs. Grace and Katherine Dawson had found each other in the Wild West of 1882, two broken people who somehow made each other whole. They had lived and loved and built something that would outlast them by generations, and it had all started with a frightened woman's plea and a good man's promise. "Please do not touch me," she had said, and he had honored that request for a full month, sleeping on a hard floor and earning her trust one night at a time. It was not the beginning either of them had imagined, but it was the beginning they needed. And from that imperfect start, they had created something perfect. A love story for the ages, a testament to the power of patience and respect, and proof that sometimes the greatest romance begins not with a kiss, but with the simple act of keeping a promise.